This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
First year PhD student from the University of Manchester. Her PhD title is Generational Conflict in Contemporary West African Cinema, and the paper that she's going to be delivering today is called Going East or West, Francophone West Africa according to Abderrahmane, that's probably wrong.
Abderrahmane?
Close. Sissako. Go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to warn you, I am going to spoil these films for you, so but please go see them. That's the reason why I'm not showing you a clip, because I'm obviously revealing the plot. So the visuals I'll leave up to you, and hopefully you'll go see some of these films. So Abderrahmane Sissako is a Mauritanian-born filmmaker who spent most of his childhood and adolescence in Mali. He then left to study film in Moscow and eventually settled in France. He's the latest in a line of Francophone West African filmmakers who have made a name for themselves outside of the African continent, especially with his latest film Timbuktu, winning 2 awards at the Cannes Film Festival last year and 7 awards at this year's Sissako Film Awards in France. In this paper, I would like to look at Timbuktu as a part of a trilogy, along with Sissako's previous 2 films, Waiting for Happiness in 2002 and Bamako from 2006, and discuss the recurring theme of young protagonists attempting and eventually failing to depart their homes. Since the characters do not articulate their reasons for leaving, I will argue that the real cause of their urge to depart lies in the spatial and temporal limitations on their movement within the towns and villages they reside in. These limitations, I find, are due to the remoteness of the protagonist's locations, but the limitations have often been fortified from the outside. In the first 2 films, these barriers function as a prevention of illegal immigration to the west, and in Timbuktu, they are a way for the Islamic rebels to encase the characters in a cocoon of fundamentalist ideology. So first, the Waiting for Happiness. The earliest film in this trilogy is the semi-autobiographical Waiting for Happiness. The film's main protagonist, Abdallah, returns to a small coastal village in Mauritania after having spent several years abroad. Before embarking on a journey to Europe, Abdallah stays at his mother's house, but he doesn't know anybody else in the village and doesn't speak the local dialect. The film gradually introduces a couple of other characters who will also attempt to emigrate, including Mikhail, who is a manual labourer hoping to find work in Paris, and Katra, a small boy/electrician's apprentice. All of the characters in Waiting for Happiness move freely in the landscape around their village. However, the village is located on the northernmost peninsula of Mauritania, surrounded from 3 sides by the Atlantic Ocean, and cut off on the 4th side by the vast emptiness of the Sahara Desert. Venturing far outside the village is virtually impossible without either a car or a boat, and even these means of transport are susceptible to nature's whims in the form of unbearable heat and tall ocean waves. Therefore, it is unsurprising that when Abdallah and Mikhail attempt to cross the edges of the town with the intent to go to Europe, they cannot continue in their journeys. We see Abdallah in his best clothes and carrying a suitcase as he is slowly climbing up a large sand dune outside the village, eventually giving up and sliding down to the bottom again. There, Abdallah meets another man who appears to be just going for a walk, and this man has no problem climbing the dune. This almost tragicomic situation is reminiscent of actual border control procedures, during which an individual who plans to stay at a destination for reasons other than recreation is often held up distressingly long periods of time. Ooh, I got lost. Sorry. It is one of many of the director's allusions to the intangible barrier that seems to exist between the coast of West Africa and Europe. The barrier manifests itself again in the context of Mikhail's tragic fate. We first meet him while he poses for photos with his friends in front of an Eiffel Tower poster in a photographer's studio as they celebrate Mikhail's bright future in Paris. A few days later, the police discover Mikhail's dead body washed up on the beach with no identification documents on him, apart from the pictures he took with his friends earlier. Mikhail's tragic attempt to cross over to Europe on an illegal boat reminds us that the barrier between the two continents is increasingly fatal to those who choose to cross it. Moreover, as Mikhail's friend refuses to identify his body, the film points out the fact that upon crossing the barrier, Mikhail loses his identity and returns as a human body rather than an individual. Interestingly, we are alerted to the presence of the above-mentioned barrier throughout the film. There are several shots of what looks like both oil tankers and aircraft carriers, excuse my lack of naval knowledge, cruising around the coast near the village, and these serve as a reminder of both the alleged economic cooperation between Europe and Africa, but also as an illustration of the physical detachment of Europe, since the ships are always seen at the same distance and without any signs of humans on board. Furthermore, as this film was made in 2002, which saw a rise in political collaboration between Mauritania and Europe, the insurmountable and yet intangible barrier between the two places turns into an ironic comment on the nature of Western cooperation with non-Western partners. In other words, such collaboration happens perhaps during diplomatic visits, but the non-Western citizens are always kept at a distance. And yet not every character in the film seeks to find freedom by immigrating to Europe, as is illustrated in the story of Katra, the small boy / electrician's apprentice. Katra decides to stay in the village. He gets the job he always wanted, and the film ends with the shot of Katra wearing his blue overalls and disappearing behind a sand dune. Similar to the man climbing the dune in front of Abdallah, Katra is free to move around the landscape, and spatial limitations do not apply to him. Thus, this final scene can be read as a comment by the director on the fact that it is personal happiness what ultimately makes this character free in his environment, and the feeling is not dependent on his location. Sissako's next feature film was released in 2006 and entitled Bamako. The film is set in Mali, in the courtyard of a large house that happens to be location for a trial of the International Monetary Fund, and explores strategies of help on the African continent. Witnesses tell stories of personal misery in order to give evidence against the IMF, and the trial is being watched and broadcasted on the radio to others waiting outside the house. Meanwhile, Mele and Chaka, who are among the house's many inhabitants, have arrived at the breaking point in their marriage, and Mele decides to leave her unemployed husband to develop her singing career in Senegal. In Bamako, the barrier I have mentioned previously remains in existence, but is redefined. There is now a clear boundary between the outside of the house and the inside, which is where the trial is taking place, and which is guarded by a policeman who decides who gets to come inside. This spatial boundary also constitutes a temporal boundary, in the sense that the trial which is happening inside the house is a regurgitation of the IMF's wrongdoing in the past, whereas outside the house, life goes on and characters try to make the best out of what they have in the present. When this binary of inside and outside is established, the film introduces us to a young couple whose marriage deteriorates precisely because of this spatial and temporal boundary. Although the film never discloses why Mele decides to leave for Senegal, it becomes apparent that her attitude to life is one of moving on towards the future and differs greatly from Chaka's persistence in the past. Despite the fact that the trial is taking place on the steps of her front room, she doesn't seem to care for it at all as she steps out of the house every morning to ask one of the guards to fasten her corset. She then walks through the middle of the improvised courtroom and leaves the house to go to the bar where she works as a singer. Chaka, on the other hand, stays inside the compound all day, listening to the trial. However, the house doesn't stay cut off from the present all of the time, and we see other women living in the house doing their laundry and listening in on the trial. There is also a wedding reception going on in the background, and a lonely man is dying on his bed in one of the house's units. The intrusion of these stages of human life into the process of the trial is a reminder that the present affects how we perceive the past, and that unhealthy obsession with the past, especially in Chaka's case, means that the character forgets what is really important in the present. Yet the idea that by moving out of the house, and therefore out of the past and into the future, is going to improve Mele's chances in life, is later problematized during the trial, when we hear a witness statement by the recently returned illegal immigrant, Sissako. When Assa talks about his experience growing up in an impoverished Malian family, the film presents us with the scene of a large group of immigrants crossing the desert, some of whom are later seen lying dead on the sand as their fellow migrants strip them of their bottled water and continue on their journey. Like Waiting for Happiness, Bamako opens up space for its characters to move around, but it also imposes limits on their movement, especially when it is in relation to Europe. In the case of Mele, we never find out whether she actually realizes her journey, but based on her relatively relaxed composure when she announces her departure to Senegal, it appears she doesn't expect any trouble when traveling within the continent. Chaka, however, becomes so paralyzed by living in the past, so that when the trial ends and he walks out of the house and discovers the present has not been affected by the trial outcome in any way, he commits suicide at the end of the film. Finally, I would like to talk about Sissako's 2014 film called Timbuktu. Timbuktu is set in a small town near the great ancient Malian city during the occupation of by Islamic rebels. The narrative's major focus is on Kidan, Satima, and their young daughter Toya, and the young boy apprentice who are Tuareg cow herders living outside the town. But the film consists of episodic departures, focusing on how the nonsensical rules imposed by the rebels affect people's everyday lives, families, and even leisure activities. When Kidan, the father of the herding family, fatally wounds a fisherman who killed one of his cows, the rebels become responsible for implementing justice. In this film, the representation of space changes noticeably from the previous two films. Since Timbuktu takes place during an Islamic takeover, most of the characters living in the town have been stripped of all of their freedom of movement. The rebels are constantly combing through the town with their guns hanging off their shoulders, looking for any potential violations of the rules imposed by their regime. During the day, they zoom around the town in their off-road cars or motorcycles, and at night they walk on top of the houses using their mobile phones as flashlights. It is evident from these scenes that the rebels are usurping the inhabitants' free movement and using it as a tool to exert power over them. In fact, when we find out that the leader of the rebel group has to have a personal driver because he doesn't know how to drive, his authority immediately suffers in both our eyes, but even in the eyes of the young driver, who begins to tease the rebel leader about his lack of skills. Furthermore, there is a mysterious character who rides a motorbike and transports items and people, but he doesn't belong to the rebel group. He doesn't appear to be breaking any of the rebels' laws, but he is nevertheless seen as a threat, purely because of his ability to move freely within the film's landscape. There are, of course, instances in which the inhabitants of the town try to reclaim their freedom of movement, and because these scenes have a strong comical nature, they are twice as subversive of the Islamist regime. One of these scenes is set on a football field outside the town, where we see a large pack of boys playing football. As the camera focuses more closely on the individual boys, we realize that they are only pretending to play football because their ball was taken by a rebel patrol earlier in the scene. When they spot a rebel patrol approaching them again on a motorcycle, the boys slow down their forbidden game and start stretching instead, much to the frustration of the patrol. As a consequence, the boys in this scene manage to restore their sense of equality with the rebels, in part because they are free to move in space, but even more so because they are able to make fun of the rebels' rigorous adherence to fundamentalist rules. Ultimately, it is through the storyline of the cowherder's family that Sissako comments on both the cocooning of this community by the Islamic regime, as well as on the relationship between Mali and Europe, or the West more generally. It is definitely not an equal relationship, and one marked by absence and detachment on the part of Europe. During the film, we see various technological gadgets, smartphones, off-road cars, cameras that have trickled out of the West and are now being used by the rebels to exert control over the inhabitants of the town. On the other hand, Toya, who owns a mobile phone, cannot reach her father due to the lack of signal and waits endlessly for the phone to ring. The technology appears to work only to benefit the rebels, consequently restricting the freedom of the locals even more. The absence of European solidarity with the occupied Malians is manifested most distinctly during the final scene of the film. Hexagone is about to be shot. Satima attempts to stop the execution. Tragically, neither of the parents survive, and Toya, who was told to stay at home, hears the shots and starts running into the desert. The film ends with a fade-out shot of Toya's tearful face as she keeps running away. Until now, Toya has been one of the strongest characters in the film, but as she loses both of her parents, she becomes very vulnerable. The fact that just before the film ends, Toya's run is interspersed with shots of a running antelope helps to underscore her status of a dehumanized prey for the rebels. The ending becomes even more disturbing when we realize that Toya really has nowhere to run. As she is so vulnerable, the narrative convention in cinema would be to provide some token of hope, a safe destination for Toya to run towards. However, the film fades out from the shot of her face, still running, implying that there will be no immediate help in the direction she is running to. Assuming that the direction is away from Islamic rebels and points towards Europe, then the absence of any signs of rescue or shelter signals a worrying detachment and apathy in response to brutality against civilians. In conclusion, Sissako intentionally chooses to set his films in remote or restrictive spaces because it allows him to both observe the characters' interaction and movement within a small place, but he is also able to capture the sad poetics, often inscribed in leaving these distant communities. That said, the characters in Sissako's films do not always find their way out of their original spaces they inhabit, which suggests that there are boundaries invisible to the characters. Such boundaries, often emphasized by large geographic features, reveal a world where freedom of migration is a flawed concept, especially if the migration is in the direction of the West. In all of the films, the West is portrayed only symbolically, but its detachment and guardedness against trespassers is expressed very strongly in these symbols. If Sissako's films can be taken as a reflection of the day-to-day relationship between Francophone West Africa and Europe, then the continuing motive of European detachment becomes an unsettling observation of Europe's reluctance to cooperate economically and politically as equals. And so the sand dunes and the waves of the Atlantic become an unsurmountable barricade.
Okay, next up we have Leah Holz, who is from the University of Colorado, but is currently studying as a lectrice at Tours near Paris. She's in her third year. She doesn't have a title for a PhD yet, but she's interested in music, literature, early 20th century representations of what it means to be female, and the title of her paper today is Orientating Haiti towards the International Musical Spiralism and Transcendence in Les Affres d'un défi by Frankétienne.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Kaya and Nani for organizing this conference and for everyone for staying through the end to listen to the last presentation. Just before I begin, this is very much a work in progress. I think I've spoken to a few of you about how our university system is quite different in the US. So we're encouraged to have a lot of side projects even as we begin the PhDs. So this is a project I'd like to keep on the back burner, but it won't be my dissertation topic. So any recommendations for directions or ways to take it would be very welcomed. In the 1979 Haitian spiralist novel Les Affres d'un défi by Frankétienne, the power of collective agency is latent in moments of music and ceremony. The repetition of sounds reveals the influence of the Vodou religion and Haitian music as cultural production, while exposing the agitation and power of the Haitian people. Written under the Bébé Doc Duvalier regime, this work is emblematic of the emotions of the Haitian people who were persecuted during this time period. The novel is a complicated story about characters in power that exploit a zombie army and a faithful housemaid who is forbidden to put salt in the zombies' food, keeping with the tradition of the household. Before going further, it's important to note the difference between Haitian and Hollywood zombies. Haitian zombies, they come from Haiti, the American occupation, but Haitian zombies are the revived dead, manipulated and controlled by a sorcerer with magic. So this idea of zombies being manipulated by someone in power. Frankétienne calls spiralism a, quote, veritable cri de coeur from within the space of François Duvalier's Haiti and out to the wider world. It is an approach to literature that evokes the possibilities for self-realization available to the individual, even in repressive situations, end quote. Spiralist echoes of the text call the reader to enter into Haiti's history at the same time as they open up the potentiality of the collective we to act. While the story itself is opaque and disorientating, the author uses methods at different textual levels to reorientate the reader. For example, with distinct typography for each of the three main voices in the novel. Yet, along with wordplay and textual games, these voices whirl together in a spiral that at once disorientates the reader and orientates Haiti toward the international. With this opening, as well as the novel's fluidity, repetition, opacity, and circularity, Les Affres d'un défi is an example of spiralism par excellence. Using Kaima Glover's work in Haiti Unbound, a spiralist challenge to the post-colonial canon, I will attempt to uncover meaning in the deep, complex layers of the novel. I will argue the importance of Haitian music inside and outside of the text and how it is at once dizzying, confusing, transfixing, and grounding. By exposing the spiralist methods Frankétienne uses to disorient the reader, I will explore how this novel situates Haiti and its history in the direction of an international audience. In her book, Glover writes about three different spiralist authors, including Frankétienne, Jean-Claude Vignoly, and René Philoptet. And she describes what she calls the games of frenzied wordplay used by the authors and how they, quote, mobilize the barely contained whirlwind of the spiral, a delicate balance of centripetal and centrifugal forces, of opposing pressure to at once collapse inward and release outward. The spiral effectively allegorizes this tension between the insular and the global work in the fiction. It offers a path via which the three authors have been able to universalize their creative perspective without literally or figuratively abandoning the particular states of their island, end quote. The spiralists hide behind several different writing methods, such as ellipses, metaphor, and experimental form, in order to say what they couldn't say under such a regime. Glover describes these methods as a mirror offered to the reader of the, quote, troubled relationship between identity, place, and the past in the post-colonial Caribbean, end quote. At the same time, the spiralist texts open up possibilities of understanding, being unbound by theory, as Glover calls it. One could say that their opacity reduces them to silence. One of the literary methods that renders this text difficult to access, for example, is in the choice of typographies. There are three parts, three voices mixed together in no clear form, and Frankétienne chose a different typography for each one, italics, regular, and bold. While this could be seen as an attempt to orientate the reader, and actually makes the story more complex and difficult to piece together. Glover argues that this ambiguous form was necessary to better transmit the particularities of Haiti, and that Frankétienne believes that every narrative must create its own form in order to accurately reflect reality. The swirling of the three narratives represents the image of the delicate balance of the spiral perfectly. And here you have a picture of Cyclone Jean, one of the many natural disasters to hit Haiti in recent past. The cyclone not only encapsulates the image of the spiral, but it also calls to mind the representation of Haiti by world media, even today, with the 5-year anniversary of the earthquake this past January. Moreover, the cyclone is an image used repeatedly, both literally and figuratively, throughout Les Affres and défi. Just to get another version of the spiral, here's a painting done by Frankétienne, who is also an artist and playwright among many other professions. You can see the swirling paint in the circular fluid shapes of the figures standing in a circle. One of the goals of the spiralists is to open Haiti toward the international world. Constantly shifting techniques in order to resonate with reality, Les Affres and défi comes out of an original version by Frankétienne written in Creole called Défi. Frankétienne modified Défi and wrote it in French, which revealed Haiti's reality to new readers. He also included a glossary with definitions of Haitian Creole terms he uses throughout the novel to aid a more universal understanding of the story that is already opaque and difficult to access. Glover says that with these modifications, Frankétienne created new centers and margins in the peripheral space of America. Haiti in relation to the world is linked to the relations between the individual and the universal in Les Affres and défi. In consequence, this relationship is emblematic of Frankétienne's use of spiralism. Glover writes about it as, quote, this dialectic of the individual and the universal, of the closed and the open, precisely encapsulated in the form of the spiral, a form that allows such apparent contradictions to remain intact, functionally unresolved, largely untheorized, end quote. She also writes of the Galodrome, a place frequently referenced throughout the novel, as an example of the insular versus the universal. The theme of participation in history or in the world is found throughout this novel, and what is more, this illustrates a base element of the Vodou religion in Haiti. Fleuron, in his article called The Music of Haitian Vodou, writes about participation in Vodou ceremony as, quote, everyone participates, everyone is healed. For the person, regardless of ethnicity or gender, is welcome to participate fully in the spiritual and community's encounter with the Noir. End quote. The Noir is the spirit of Haitian voodoo. This inclusive culture is symbolic of the awakening of the zombies in the novel, and their participation in entering into their own history, which I'll return to later in this paper. Another important part of the Haitian culture repeated throughout the novel is rara, a form of collective performance with a group that comes together and travels from one village to the next, performing along the way. According to Elizabeth McAllister in her book called Rara, Vodou, Power and Performance in Haiti and its Diaspora, rara has global connections and is a performance form that has both a transnational past and present. She talks about this form as being a, quote, byproduct of the Atlantic slave trade and the creolized interculture that colonialism produced, end quote. Rara also has religious connections, and while it has a Vodou influence, there's also a strong Catholic context to the performance. They often occur during Lent, or right before Easter. Raras are important in this analysis because they encourage criticism. For example, McAllister refers to raras during political troubles in Haiti in the 1990s. Quote, rara both creates popular solidarity and conveys cognitive messages to the dominant classes of the strength and power of the disenfranchised. Within this expressive politics, the significance and connotations of words and phrases are manipulated in a dialogic process of figurative change. Meanings and their reference can and do shift quickly and unpredictably. When rara bands move in large numbers through public thoroughfares, singing fun about current events, they open up a social space for popular expression. Rara creates a semi-autonomous stage for discourse under conditions of insecurity, end quote. Rara isn't only representative of the universal, it also symbolizes the spiralist movement in literature of the play on words, meaning, and sounds inherent within this form. Even the rara and its instruments are mentioned many times throughout Frankétienne's novel. The interlacing of Haitian cultures such as Vodou and rara in the novel highlights the text as a representation of Haitian individuality. Just as in rara, sometimes Frankétienne's words are superimposed with meaning and are also chosen for their sound. Before a stream of consciousness section, the author writes, déchiffrant le sens au creux du son. We notice a musical language in the word choice as well as in the sonority, rhythm, and repetition of words throughout the text. An example of the play on meaning is with the word ronde, which is repeated many times throughout the novel. The first example you see underlines the incessant movement of circulation, a ronde infernale. The word ronde is also linked to Vodou in nature, again this image of the wind, and a mapu, which is a tree, and in Vodou it represents the crossroads between the spiritual and physical world. The third example, the ronde à l'aigre babaresque, describes the living world of Port-au-Prince and paints the image of the noisy circulation of cars. The next, in italics, is in the voice of the collective we, describing a ronde enfantine about the sun and the moon. In the final example, un totalito déglingué, the ronde here is hidden behind the Creole word totalito, which, according to Frankétienne's glossary, is a childish rondo characterized by back and forth movement. And of course, the ronde is a type of dance and musical form that is notable as a circle, the emblem of spiralism. Along with the variation of meanings, time is also fluid in this novel. Glover even goes as far as calling it a temporal vacuum. At the terrestrial level, there are many references to water, the sea, and thunderstorms. Here you see an image of a Vodou ceremony that is taking place in a river, for example, underlining the significance of water and fluidity in Haitian culture. Stormy images are apparent at a figurative level in the play and typography. Additionally, words and sentences slide together, and meaning is difficult to decipher. The rhythm of the text brusquely changes from section to section, just like a storm traversing the land. There is also fluidity in the characters. Glover writes about a clear lack of protagonists in spiralist novels, and that the authors, quote, challenge the legitimacy of spectacular heroism or individual transcendent wholeness, and instead emphasize the often schizophrenic inextricability of self and others, end quote. This is a clear link to Vodou ceremony in the Mounting of the Noir. Glover also writes that identities change arbitrarily, relationships are unstable, and spiralist characters, quote, seem to exist without reference, fragmented and unpredictable. Like musical passages and textual symphonies, they literally and figuratively bounce off, echo, double, and reflect one another, end quote. Like the agglomeration that is Rara, the ambiguity of characters' identities in Les Affres adds to the significance and substance of the collective we in Haiti. There are a few temporal anchors in the novel. For example, bells ring out and represent the passing of time and bring the characters back to reality. Bells are also used in reference to the noise and shape of a storm or cyclone passing through the island. The Vodou dance of the Yandalou is a good example of Frankétienne's style of weaving music and meteorological symbols together with Haitian traditions. This dance is referred to at the beginning of the novel, describing leaves and branches that dance the Yandalou in a gust of wind during a storm. In his glossary, Frankétienne describes the Yandalou as a Vodou dance, mimicking the wave-like movements of the grass snake, which is the zoomorphic symbol of Vodou religion. He also writes that it evokes the movements of ocean waves. Like the bells, the rooster is an important sound symbol in the book. He represents a sort of anchor to reality by awakening the people to a new day. Yet he also exists in the interstitial space between night and day, just like the zombies, whose state is what Frankétienne refers to at the beginning of the book as a constant battle between life and death. Moving on to another important symbol, a musical symbol, the drum. This instrument is a principal part of Haitian culture and daily life. It is essential in Vodou ceremony as well as in Rara. The Haitian drum even represents the collective we. In his book, Tambour frappé, haïtien campé, Abderrahmane Saint-Pierre describes the drum as a liberated and liberating instrument, which after the 1804 victory became a symbol of the soul of the Haitian people, and everyone took pride in being able to play it. The drums in Les Affres are like a beating of the collective heart, which indicate a part of humanity that remains with the zombies. Hope. the novel, a fistful of salt dissolves in a large cauldron of boiling water. Just as salt increases the speed at which a pot of water boils, it is used in the novel as what brings the zombies back to life. By consuming it, zombies are accorded humanity, and we discover that it is impossible for them to stay in the liminal space between life and death. Just as a side note, there's an interesting history of salt and slavery in Haiti, and salt is an essential part of life, especially in a hot, humid climate. If you're interested in more information about that, there's a book by Mark Kurlansky called Salt, A World History. The image of the boiling pot of water is repeated subtly and not so subtly throughout the book. We find it, for example, in the sonorous agitation of the waves and storms, as well as in the reiteration of the zombie chants of we won, that increase exponentially as the drums accelerate. At the peak of the novel, the group starts frantically to dance the nago, a Vodou dance. Dawn begins, there's an explosion of sound, the rhythm speeds up, and the reader is immersed in the image of the boiling pot of water, the awakening of the zombie's consciousness. The murmur that was once unperceivable becomes undeniable. When waking up and causing change, people need a strategy, a direction, both of which are themes found throughout this book, for example with zombies at the crossroads. At the end of the novel, one of the characters asks the group, this is my translation, where are we going? Where do we want to truly go? Why do we continue to wander about the night with no objective? It is essential that we unite together with our fellow countrymen to follow one single path together, a path for liberty for all. It is urgent that together we form a united front. When Frankétienne wrote Les Affres, he did not just translate from his original novel in Creole, he also added and varied scenes which orientate Haiti toward the world, or the world toward Haiti. For example, some added scenes where zombies are imprisoned in horrible spaces recall the oppression from the Middle Passage, which also implicates a more global audience in the history of Haiti. Writing, the act of writing for Frankétienne, was a strategy to declare Haiti as a subject. Glover says that, quote, to create art in the post-colonial Caribbean is in and of itself to declare an autonomous subjectivity, end quote. In this text written in French, Frankétienne posits Haiti in a Francophone world, while declaring her independence and calling for Haitians' involvement in their own histories. While Frankétienne calls the reader to enter into Haiti's history, opening it to a global audience, Glover's book opens the literary history of spiralism to the rest of the world by challenging the Francophone post-colonial canon. The tools used by the spiralists open the zombies' possibility and reveal their dormant hope, what Glover calls the possibility of the infinite. The capacity to act that the Haitian people possess is an important part of collective memory that's preserved and distributed in the Vodou religion. The importance of collective memory is also apparent in Rara performances, which McAllister calls, quote, an entire history of ideas transmitted through the performances themselves, end quote. The music present in the daily lives of the Haitian people is an integral part of the institutional memory of the Caribbean, what some scholars call signposts that allow people to reconstruct their past. I argue that this novel is preserving aspects of these performances in a different medium and opening these traditions up to a much wider audience. The multitude of ways music and sound are used throughout the text invoke not only these traditions, but also the power of collective agency and the potentiality of the Haitian people, even under dire circumstances. I found that in the end, this novel does orientate Haiti toward the international community in a way that's quite different from the sensationalism and negative spin taken by the media. Thank you.